Now let me introduce our speaker to you. Our speaker this evening is the Right Honourable Lord Owen. David Owen studied medicine at Sydney Sussex College, Cambridge, and qualified as a doctor in 1962, and began work at St Thomas's Hospital, London, where he was a neurological and psychiatric registrar from 1964 to 1966, and research fellow in neuroscience. He was elected Labour Member of Parliament for the Plymouth Sutton constituency in 1966, and later became Labour MP for the adjacent Plymouth Devonport constituency. His parliamentary career included roles as Minister of State for Health, Minister of State at the Foreign Office, Foreign Secretary, and Shadow Energy Secretary. He was co-founder of the Social Democratic Party and its leader from 1983 to 1987 and 1980 to 90. He was created a Life Baron, Lord Owen of the City of Plymouth in 1992, and sits as an independent Social Democrat in the House of Lords. From 1992 to 1995, Lord Owen served as EU peace negotiator in the former Yugoslavia, alongside the UN-appointed peace negotiator Cyrus Vance. Together they co-authored the Vance-Owen Peace Plan. Lord Owen has been associated with several political campaigns since leaving the House of Commons. He was chairman of New Europe, a cross-party organisation that successfully campaigned against the UK adopting the euro. In January 2010, prior to the general election, he helped establish a new website, Charter 2010, a forum and information source aimed at planning for a hung parliament. In March 2011, he joined the No to AV, Yes to PR campaign. In 2016, believing that the EU had become dysfunctional and opposed to the inexorable direction towards a federal United States of Europe, he concluded it was in the best interests of the UK to leave the EU and supported and campaigned for vote leave in the EU referendum. The title of his presentation this evening is Hubris, the Road to Donald Trump, Power, Populism and Narcissism. I ask you now to welcome the Right Honourable Lord David Owen.
Well, good evening, and thank you for asking me and allowing me to see and hear part of your dialogue. I'm sad I won't be able to be with you for most of tomorrow because I've got to cross England and reach Alba by tomorrow evening, so I would like to be here the whole time. I think it's a fascinating subject that you've chosen and some very interesting speakers, all of which I could learn a lot from. But I'm not going to speak. I'll give you at least half the agenda time available to us for questions. So I'm going to try and take a few attempts to explain the world we're in at the moment from one vantage point, and that is to look at the nature of the leadership we've had over the last few decades. And I start, and introductory speaker hinted at this, by looking at how we have seen leadership over many, many centuries. The title of this book is Hubris, the Road to Donald Trump. But hubris is, of course, a Greek word, and there are still many things to learn from Greek civilization. And one of the things which they took a very serious look at is how democracy could work, how you would live with leadership, how you would control the military. And there are very few things that don't trouble us today that didn't trouble the Greeks. And hubris was one of the issues which they were most concerned about. And they were particularly worried about the leader who started to show a contempt for the people that they led. And hubris is used, I find now, more and more. I started writing about it and thinking about it in, I suppose, 2002. And I think the important thing to realize is not just that hubris and nemesis go together, nemesis follows hubris, but the sense that the Greeks had that the quality of leadership and the way they led was of fundamental importance to what their civilization was and what was their democracy. And I think we are very wary of analyzing our leaders. The financial crisis that hit the world in 2008 is where we still are, really. And its roots, if you look at the key decision makers that were in the world at that time, has huge elements of hubris. Look at the chief executive of Lehman Brothers. Look at the chief executive of RBS. Look at their characters. Look at the way they led their organizations, how they shut out any form of criticism. And I think, therefore, when you look at this world that we're in, I tried to analyze what was going wrong with leaders, and I started at looking at their illnesses. And certainly the pattern of decision-making amongst many of our political leaders and some of our generals and a lot of our business people, there is no doubt that character flaws and attitudes which they have and have developed in their positions of power are extremely important for their actual effect on people's lives in a very, very major way. But when I talk about hubris, I don't mean just politicians or big business leaders or key generals. Most of the British public are well aware of it. They think of it in different words. Power's gone to their head. Or the old aphorism about all power tends to corrupt, absolute power corrupts absolutely. People see it in the headmaster of a school, a consultant in a hospital, the person in the local co-op branch. We saw it in the cooperative bank, for goodness sake. And we see it, of course, in our political and other leaders. This is commonplace. That's the first lesson I've learned about this. I started about writing about it as political leaders, and I've become more and more convinced it's commonplace. It's much easier, of course, to analyze political leaders, A, because a lot is written about them. They speak and their views are recorded, and you watch them, many of you, for a period of decades, and you see them go bad in front of your own eyes. And therefore we have to start, or at least look at this whole question. But of course, sometimes illness lies behind decision-making. I mean, you can't look at the Suez Crisis of 1956, which was arguably, and people may say now Brexit is, but let's discuss that later in questions. But the Suez Crisis was one of the most humiliating failures of the British. And the then Prime Minister, Anthony Eden, is rightly criticised for a heavy responsibility of how he dealt with NASA's nationalisation of the Suez Canal, and then went into a dirty deal in respect of both Israel and France in trying to pretend that there was an intervention along the Suez Canal and that they were not in any way connected with the Israeli advance on the Suez Canal, and that the British and French hadn't plotted the whole thing. It then became obvious and became known that in fact Anthony Eden and the French and Israelis all lied, and increasingly lied to the Americans and above all to President Eisenhower, and landed themselves in a dreadful mess. But one of the key problems was that Eden was suffering from the results of a failed operation on his bile duct, an accidental cut by the surgeon, which led to infection of his liver and led to very high temperatures at a crucial point in the decision-making of the Suez Canal crisis in September of 1956. He had a temperature of 106 and spent 2 days in hospital without anybody realizing. He was also on a whole bevy of drugs. Now, I therefore initially approached this whole issue from looking at decision-making and often relating to illness. And I think it's a starting off point. But it's not the really deep problem. The deeper problem, it's explicable. You have a temperature of 106, you are under great strain and stress. Your decision-making is going to be affected. If you're President Kennedy and you have Addison's disease, which means that your adrenals, which sit on top of your kidneys on either side, progressively pack up, and in his case, right from a very early age, were affected, and you then take recreational drugs on a very high quantity and get yourself involved with quack doctors in New York, one of whom's name was called Dr. Feelgood, who fed into this man who was having to have replacement therapy for his adrenal glands, i.e. a steroid, prednisone, but it was in different form in those days, and also other things. But you add amphetamine and extra steroids and other opiate drugs. So when you come to the Bay of Pigs, which was the first crisis that he faced as a president, he made, by even his standards, he openly admitted a terrible mistake. And he went on to make deep mistakes in his first meeting with Khrushchev in 1956 in Vienna, all of it under a grotesque abuse of drugs. Fortunately for us all, the doctors did get a grip of his drug taking. They did reduce his drugs. He did start to exercise for the pains in his back, which were probably related to early treatment with steroids as a young man. And by the time the real crisis hit us, the Cuban Missile Crisis, which I believe he handled absolutely brilliantly, we were dealing with a completely different person, a person who was much more rational, much more in possession of his own faculties, and also who had learned from the mistakes he'd made and conducted himself extraordinarily well. Now, that's enough of real illness. I could go through a whole checkered history of that. But the problem about the brain and your character and your attitudes, this is not, you can't put a finger on it in terms of illness. You can't come up with a cure, and you can't come up with great changes unless you are prepared to discuss it. Now, the banks, after 2008, invested billions of pounds in statistical models about what went wrong. But the amount of money that they're prepared to put into behavioral research of why these people make these decisions and the underlying sociological and other facts about behavior and judgment and decision-making, minuscule expenditure. Why? Because these people control the research budgets and they don't want to open themselves to criticism. It's all too personal. So we've got to get over this hurdle and start to get people to look seriously at behavioral change. Now, I defined what I called Hubris Syndrome in a number of articles, some of which were in medical journals initially, and I went back to my early past, in which I was both a neurologist and a psychiatrist, and then a neuroscientist doing work with dopamine, which is one of the neurotransmitters that we hear a lot about. Now, I experienced what is called peer review. In my day, when I was a young doctor, that hardly existed at all. And now is a pretty good way of trying to produce scientific writing against objective standards and criticisms of your peers. And journalists, by and large, journalists don't take it unless they have some feedback from their criticism and the author takes account of it. But I'm not a doctor, really, any longer. I'm a lapsed doctor. Now they've even taken me off the General Medical Council. I can't even prescribe for myself. But I tried to look at this whole history of it all and analyze, and started obviously, in my case, with prime ministers. Then I was lucky to find a professor of psychiatry at Duke University in the United States who had coordinated one of the most important surveys of the mental health of presidents. And we put the two things together in an article in Brain in 2008, and it was called Hubris Syndrome, a acquired personality disorder question mark. Now, in my more recent writing, I would take away the question mark, and I would also take away disorder, because that has a very medical connotation, and I don't think this is quite accurate, and it is better to use an expression which is commonly more used now amongst psychiatrists and call it a personality trait. But the fundamental thing is that it's acquired. Now, the problem is, if you look at the writings of Freud, Jung, Adler, they contributed to, in many ways, greatly to our understanding of how we thought. Well, it's not just dreams, it was actually how we look at our personalities and everything like that. But in part influenced by their writing, an atmosphere grew up that personality was probably what you were born with, and that by the age of 19 or so, personality didn't really change. When we started to see the casualties of war coming into our lives, and we started to read about post-traumatic stress disorder, the medical profession fought this as a medical diagnosis. They were not, because they were used to thinking that personality couldn't change and was not acquired. Gradually, and fortunately, just about the time I was starting to write 15 years ago, the medical profession did grudgingly and now pretty wholeheartedly accept that post-traumatic stress disorder is an acquired personality change. That has meant it much easier to get people to contemplate that hubris, arrogance, total contempt for others, inability to listen, a attitude to people which is to listen to what you want to listen, selective listening, and a whole range of other faculties and things which are described in my books. So it's become very close from I won't say hostility, but a deep skepticism, more accepted in the medical profession, that personalities can change, and that hubris is a spectrum of leadership qualities which manifest themselves in a different form. So I looked at British prime ministers, and I like to define hubris syndrome very limited way. Firstly, if you have depression, I've tended to say don't use the word hubris syndrome, because depression is often accompanied by anxiety, and it is also accompanied in terms of bipolar, which is what we used to call a mega. Every now and then I get the words wrong, so I'll leave that one. But manic depression it used to be called. But in this bipolar, which is more a spectrum disease nowadays, the British tended to, probably changed in the last 20 years, but before that there had to be a real episode of manic behavior. America's always been much looser over manic depression, and there are different attitudes to medical diagnosis, even in the English-speaking world and across the Atlantic. But I tend to think that it's so difficult when you're certainly making retrospective analysis of people who've never sat opposite you one-on-one in a diagnostic role, and you're building up a picture of a prime minister from history and from writing, to avoid making this, or president, making this diagnosis if you find that you are dealing with mental illness of a real quality of depression. So I've excluded that. And I've tended also to try to exclude from the diagnosis people who's always been questionable, their personality and the qualities of insufferable arrogance or total refusal to listen to people and things like that we see. And of course, as we now see manifest in President Trump, deep-seated narcissism and these areas. And I've tried to keep this to people who at one stage in their lives, a great many people have considered completely normal. Now, it may be normal in inverted commas, but normal. And when you look at prime ministers, you know, by and large, you do vote for them. You may not like it. You don't vote for them directly, but they have to be elected members of parliament first, which is a slight sifter. Then they have to be elected by their political parties and things like that. And I looked at, of the British prime ministers over the last 150 years, I came to the conclusion that 4 of our prime ministers developed in office hubris syndrome. The first is one that was hardest for me to do because I'm Welsh. I don't have any English blood in me, and my hero for many years has been Lloyd George. And I think there is no doubt that my hero developed hubris syndrome after the First World War. He was always, you know, there were characteristics of him, Welsh characteristics and other things, but he, by common consent in 1918, was the man who won the war. His history beforehand was of a very great social reformer, a quite remarkable Chancellor of the Exchequer, a man who was ready to downgrade himself from being Chancellor of the Exchequer because he couldn't have been moved when he felt the biggest weakness was in munitions, became Minister for Munitions, became the leader of our country when Asquith was outed in 2016, and we were facing, I won't say defeat, but a very long war, and there were very real few prospects of victory, and he was remarkable. Now, he developed also a skill of having a person who he respected, the Conservative Chancellor of the Exchequer, who he would go and see every morning when he was Prime Minister in number 10, crossing over to number 11. And he would come up in with a flood of ideas for an hour and a half, and he'd leave with 1 or 2 with the sanction of the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And that was my first introduction to toeholders, people who were in the lives of decision makers who they respect and who they often keep close to them and encourage to be critics. And I'll come to that subject later. But Lloyd George lost control of the political scene, and his real political skills from 1920 to when he was thrown out in 1923. Another person who I believe suffered from hubris syndrome was Neville Chamberlain. Neville Chamberlain was a very good Minister of Health. Some people think one of the very considerable Chancellors of the Exchequer. He came into office, was popular and respected. And it is worth remembering that appeasement for a substantial period of time was a popular policy in this country. But there is very little doubt, and particularly if you look at the letters that he wrote to his sisters. He had 2 sisters. Every week he wrote a handwritten letter to one sister, who then passed it on to the next. Then the next week he wrote to the other sister, and she passed it on to her. And they're a very good insight into what he's really thinking. And the way he describes his relationship with Hitler, he really does feel that he is the only person who can deal with Hitler, that it has to be one-on-one, and he has a special insight into Hitler. And he convinces himself, with very little experience of foreign relations, that he and he alone can be the arbiter of peace. And I think there is very little doubt that he was shutting out advice, he was keeping cabinet decisions to the people who he wanted to be in the room, who he knew their views in advance, and that he developed hubris syndrome. The other British Prime Minister was Margaret Thatcher. Now, some of you will say, oh, she always was hubristic. I don't believe that's true. I watched her very carefully. I was then the leader of the SDP during the Falklands, in Parliament, before we had an elected leader, and during the Falklands War. And actually, you would be surprised how nervous she was at various stages, and how deeply upset she was when we lost frigates being bombed and a very heavy loss of life on some of the lands. Now, some people cite when she walked out to number 10 and we'd just taken South Georgia, and she said, "Rejoice, rejoice." Well, I don't believe that was hubris. I think that was relief for an incredibly dangerous operation that had come off. Her hubris developed in the last 2 years of her prime ministership. A slip of the tongue. And one of the reasons was she lost one of her considerable toeholders, Willie Whitelaw, who she'd beaten in the election. He'd taken the defeat. He'd been loyal to her and friendly to her, and he was somebody who she could respect. Now, I don't know how many of you watched the film about Thatcher with Meryl Streep, and there's a point where she's in the cabinet, and poor old Geoffrey Howe is sitting next to her as leader of the House, and she picks up a piece of paper and starts correcting his grammar and his spelling and punctuation even, and treats him with absolute contempt. No other word for it. That is actually a compression of 3 episodes during a period of over a year, which have been accurately reported by cabinet ministers. So it's a wonderful picture, but it is a compression of 3. But it's a first-class demonstration of Hubris syndrome in the making. And the loss of her toeholder of Willie Whitelaw, she would not have talked to Geoffrey Howe if opposite her in the cabinet room had been Willie Whitelaw. And then the other one, and the last one so far, I'm not sure about some of the other 2, but Tony Blair. I think Tony Blair, from 1997 as Prime Minister to 2001, was someone who had a genuine support in the country and a rather refreshing new approach, and he augured as if well for being... he'd asked me to come back to the Labour Party in 1996, and I had refused, and I rather regretted the decision as the years went by. He looked as if he was going to be successful. I now look on, it's the best decision I've ever made in my life. But nevertheless, the fact is, I think that when he won his second election in 2001, everything changed. And he changed without ever presenting any paper, any research, the whole structure of British cabinet government, which had served us so well in 2 world wars. Whatever for the hubris of Lloyd George, which I say I did not believe existed during the war and the war cabinet, and whatever the personalities of Winston Churchill, both these men led us at a moment of extraordinary peril with a real, genuine collective discussion. And some of you have seen the film about Churchill and what went on. He wrote that never in the whole history of the war cabinet had there been any discussion of peace and war being on the agenda of the cabinet. There was no agenda of the war cabinet, so strictly speaking it was 2. But it came as a great revelation when the 20-year rule was passed after 1945, and the documents started coming out, and that they had met 9 times to discuss Halifax's view that we should consider opening up peace negotiations with Mussolini. Now, firstly, get one thing clear. I believe if anyone in a war cabinet has the right to argue for peace, it would be the Foreign Secretary. The Foreign Secretary had been in the First World War at that time too, and Halifax. And I think it is fair that Churchill gave him a proper hearing. But if you read a book, there is a little book outside there which I've written about cabinet government. I couldn't write about, with any validity, the Thatcher or the Blair thing. The facts were beginning to emerge. We didn't know. But the history of the war cabinet in 1940, long, accurate minutes taken by civil servants, names of people who said what, and you can read it all in that book on the Cabinet's Finest Hour, I call it. But I wrote that book purely and simply to try to get people to realize that we have not had cabinet government in this country since 2001. We didn't have it under the Blair years. We didn't really ever get it back under Gordon Brown. A little bit of adjustment to trying to reduce power in number 10. And he was himself depressed, actually, through quite a bit of that period. But it was only 3 years. Then you had Cameron, and there is, well, you have Blair, of course, but Blair, Gordon Brown, Cameron, and then when writing this book on cabinet government, I said in the draft that I thought it had come back under Margaret Thatcher. Sorry, Theresa May. I'm absolutely delighted to have to tell you that fortunately the book had not gone to the printers, and we were able to take out, when the 2017 election came out, and she bailed out really, and people began to realize what was going on and that there had not been cabinet government, I was able to take out that sentence. And I'm very fortunate that I didn't make that error. Now, whether she has got hubris or not is more complicated, and I think we need to know more, and I'm not putting myself on a diagnosis of that. And I'm not putting myself on a diagnosis of Cameron either. Cameron I always think of as Flashman, and a well-known British character, and he's certainly impetuous, and his decision-making has been exposed somewhat over the whole question of Brexit, and we can discuss that perhaps later. But here you have 4 prime ministers anyhow: Lloyd George, Neville Chamberlain, Margaret Thatcher, and Tony Blair. Now, quite apart from the disastrous handling of the Iraq War, there are many other aspects of Blair's decision-making that need very serious discussion, and I'm extremely glad you're going to have a discussion tomorrow about the health service. I mean, it's very uncomfortable. I've never been in anything other than a Social Democrat. I've never joined any other political party. I never joined the Liberals, and I've never dreamed of being a Tory. In my family, my father has a saying, a good Welsh Liberal stock who voted Labour in 1945 in order to have a national health service. Great day of freedom for my father as a GP when he no longer had to charge a patient in his life. And he said, in our family, nobody ever votes Tory without a stiff drink before and afterwards. That's where I am in the political sphere. But you are going to discuss this with far better authorities than I, the issue of health service. I would only just say this: you can't escape the fact that the present disastrous National Health Service, in my view, and its aping the American system and its marketization, started under Blair in 2002, went on in legislation in 2006, and then was compounded by Lansley and Cameron, who knew exactly what they were going to do, never told the British public what they were going to do, and in my view, in the legislation of 2012, have put a knife to the concept of the Nair and Bevan's National Health Service, which I believe must be recovered. But that's enough for that. I won't go into these details. So you come back to this whole question. Where are we going? Well, when Trump was elected, I decided to look back on all that I'd written about hubris. He is hubristic, but he is, as an American psychiatrist wrote to the New York Times, a world-class narcissist. Does he have what is an American diagnosis mainly, but is also in Britain, which is narcissistic personality disorder? And this professor said, I introduced this diagnosis to the classification of psychiatric diseases in the United States in its 3rd edition, and he does not have a mental disorder. He may make decisions which are very bizarre and difficult to understand, but it's too easy, effectively, to explain it all away on a medical disorder. And therefore, I started to look as well, why have they got Trump? This is not a book about evaluating Trump as an American. It's not our job to say whether he should be impeached or not. It's not our job to interfere with the American elections. Incidentally, it wasn't any job of Obama to come in and inject his input into the Brexit debate. I can tell you this as somebody who was watching the polls, unofficial and private, that the Leave campaign was not going to win the referendum until Obama touched ground in this country. And the reason in 4 days, there was the only big shift in the opinion polls from 3 to 5%, was there was a deep-seated resentment of an American president coming in and telling us how to vote. Also, when he started to talk about being back of the queue, my American wife, who I may say, of course, voted to remain, as did my 3 children, so I'm a minority of 1 in a family of 5, immediately rocked with laughter, because in America it's back of the line, it's not back of a queue, and she knew immediately that had been written in Downing Street. Now, this is book, therefore, stays well out of their American debate. But what it does ask is, how could a man like that become the President of the United States by democratic votes? And in particular, are there similarities between that phenomenon and what we've experienced in the surprise result of the Brexit referendum? And I do think we have to look at these Rust Belt states in America, and people have now looked at this in very great depth of the opinion polls and the opinion polls in Brexit. And what you are seeing is a revolt in many, many aspects, but one important element is a revolt against Washington and New York. In America, the financial center and the capital are separate. And in many of the areas outside London, you see the same phenomenon. It is a deep-seated dislike of the power and the wealth of London that has brought up over many years. Now, I have to say, Brexit we leave to questions, but you cannot and must not, wherever you are in this sort of debate, and it might be easier if you have very passionate views about Brexit, to look first at the American data, and a lot has been written about this, and not understand that inequalities of income, inequality of aspiration, a general feeling of neglect, even an elitist disdain for the way of life of many people outside the great metropolis, has affected politics in a very deep way. There is no question that without the Rust Belt states, you would not have President Trump. Now, he exploited it, of course, but how is he able to exploit it? I think they were quite pleased that he was very wealthy. Actually, of course, we now know he isn't anywhere near as wealthy as he pretends. But also, he has skills on being the equivalent of we mirrored it, The Apprentice, that he used to do this television world, right across American states. He acquired skills of delivery, skills of simplification, of using not very complicated language, and techniques of handling television, which were well honed on this issue of The Apprentice, and nothing to do with politics. There are other factors, of course, as well, which we should look at in the whole relationship. I say, not to delve into American politics, but to try to understand how that happened, and then to do the same when you look at it. If you looked at the people who were looking at opinion polls in depth, and sociologists, they were warning for decades that there was a stirring outside London, that London was not representative, and the polls that were geared too much to London sampling, and it's very easy to sample that where you're closest to, were misleading, and also a lot of the in-depth research was not being done that is done in sociology polls, because they cost more and they're more elaborate techniques. And we were warned, therefore. And we need to look very carefully at this, because if we don't look carefully at it, we won't get it right. We won't correct it. We won't deal with this problem. And we have a deep-seated problem in our country now, whatever happens with Brexit. And we need to try to understand it. You will not solve these problems without being truthful with yourself. I mean, Plymouth, where I was born and bred, I'm Welsh, but I was born and bred in Plymouth, and represented for 26 years, the longest any MP has ever represented Plymouth, just short of Nancy Astor, the American, who represented it. They voted 60-40 to go out. Now, there are a lot of reasons and everything like that, but I have watched over the 26 years now, more, because I left Parliament in '92. I went back to the constituency before I finally sort of really got positioned on Brexit. And on a sunny, early spring day, not even spring, you couldn't be sitting outside with leaflets and having a meeting without realizing the extent to which they had made up their mind years before, months before the campaign. They never use the word leave or remain. Out. With the finality, it was clear that they had made their mind up a lot earlier. So again, don't look at the analysis of this too much in the actual campaign, which was pretty disastrous on both sides, but look at it again as to how long it's taken to formulate these views, and how do we deal with it? How do we deal with a federal UK and Scotland? I mean, the surprise, in my view, was that the Welsh voted out, and the Northern Ireland voted in. I was not surprised by the Scottish vote. But London is an amazing change. I live in the East End of London, in the middle of the docks area. When I first went down there in 1965, no self-respecting person would dream of living in the dockland area where I was, and they would still had a lot of traditional East Enders. They marched when Enoch Powell made his outrageous speech on London. London now is really like Brazil. I mean, I think it's been a transformation in my life. I've watched the attitudes change. I've watched the populations change. We have a very large Bangladesh population in Tower Hamlets, where I am now. We've had them before. We had a big Jewish introduction of people in the 30s, mainly from Germany. We had Chinese, and we had Huguenots. So we've had a lot of population changes. People are adaptable. And the shift in attitude on race in London, for the better, is quite amazing. I don't know we solved all the problems by any means, but it is a remarkable transition in my little lifetime. So I think that we mustn't give up hope on these things. People will change. People can change. Some of these things are not God-given or evil-given. These are changes that come from circumstance and many different things. Hubris, I believe, to be rooted in stress. And I think that when you see it in leaders, it is a stressful life, whether it's the headmaster of a school or a headmistress of a school, or primary or a secondary, or a consultant in a hospital, as I said. It is stressful. Their personality often helps to make it stressful. We know a lot now about the neuroscience of the brain, and it may well be that there will be, in part, a neuroscience explanation for some of the hubris that develops in personality. And it may be that the anxiety that is there is fed by the neurotransmitter, which we now know a lot more about, not dopamine, which many people thought it would be, but serotonin. These are all areas for research. They're all areas for careful attention, and I want to stop very soon. So I'm coming to you today with chaos as your verdict. I think there is an epidemic of bad leadership where people come in and you think them normal, they change in their position of power, they acquire power, it has been there in American presidents, it has been there in British prime ministers. It's been there in business in New York and in London. It's been there in generals. Any of you saw the film Patton, a wonderful film, would see in General Patton the absolute epitome of hubris in a general. And then you also read about how Eisenhower, without any hubris at all in his character, handled the incident when Patton slapped in the face and called two GIs in a hospital traitor. I mean, he didn't use the word traitors, but he poured scorn and derision on them, cowards he called them, because they were languishing in hospital, obviously psychiatrically affected. He couldn't understand that a person could be psychiatric. Mrs. Thatcher had a great deal of difficulty in understanding people who are non-achievers and are always going to be non-achievers. She felt that everybody could be achievers. Everybody can't be achievers. Society has to be based on a capacity to understand that a fairly substantial percentage are going to need help. And we can't and mustn't get distressed about it. It's a fact of life. And we have to be where some are brilliant and successful, some are not going to be either brilliant or always successful. And society has to be able to embrace and keep the whole. And I think these are fundamentally important issues when we now look at this whole question of how well we are governed. So I end up by saying this. I think that the strains and stresses of modern life have produced a new syndrome in leaders, and not always famous leaders. And I've called it Hubris Syndrome, and it doesn't matter whether that name goes or fades. I don't think it's a medical psychiatric disorder, though it's right on the cusp of it, and probably better described as a trait. It is acquired, and it might therefore be able to go away when you take the stress away. Now, George Bush and Blair interreacted. They both developed hubris. The interesting thing about George Bush is that, firstly, he did have the humility to admit in the 6th year of his presidency that he hadn't put enough troops on the ground into Iraq. And he went back and admitted mistakes, which he did quite openly. It was rare for a politician, and he increased the troop level. It was a brave decision to do. Then when he was already retiring and Obama had been elected, he was approached by the then Israeli President Olmert, who asked if he would supply bombs and airplanes to bomb Iran. He rejected it. He did something very helpful to Obama. He announced, not in a public speech, but he let it be known that Olmert had come and that he'd rejected it. So the new president coming in didn't have to be subjected to that lobby from Tel Aviv and Israel. It was a decent thing to do. And then he disappeared. He retired. He didn't put himself up on television at all. He started. I know friends of his in Texas who tell me, George is back with us. He's the same old George. I mean, he'd see us when he was president, but he was just on a different planet. And I think it is a rather refreshing sign that an acquired syndrome can actually be lost. I'd love to say the same of Tony Blair, but he probably still thinks he's president, heading for world president. But I mean, he shows absolutely no sign of any shift or change in opinion. And I don't make that as a cheap point. It is a fact of life that you watch these people carefully, you've got to analyze them. So when you look at your chaos and you look at all that's happening, decision makers are important because they are making very important decisions. These people do decide whether you're going to do something seriously about inequality, if you're going to change opportunities, if you're going to increase social mobility, if you are going to challenge London's capacity to absorb vastly more sums of public money than the weaker parts of the north of England and elsewhere. These people are important, and we need to understand that they have made a major contribution to the poor governance of this country that has certainly been there for 20 years and probably a lot longer. And I think that you should also carry that in, that we have wantonly and disgracefully given up the one structure of government which we had, which was admired in many parts of it. They call it the cabinet in the United States. They are positions given by the president, taken entirely. We have made it pretty much the same. The people who go to the cabinet are not there because they represent a power base within their party. It's because they are paid by the Prime Minister. Cabinet doesn't exist, and it needs to go back. This is only one of many, many issues that you'll be discussing over the next, this weekend. I just put it into the frame to be discussed. I'm not telling you it's the most important just because they happen to be important people. But because they're important people, when they go wrong, it tends to have considerable effects, much more than you see in respects when somebody goes wrong inside a family. It affects the immediate family, but it doesn't have the same repercussions right across the country. So I leave it with you like this. Now I take questions from anyone in the floor. Okay? Right. Right.